All right. I'd like to welcome everybody to today's spotlight featuring Kendall Nicholson. He is one of the founding board members of VANOMA, and he's got a really interesting journey, I think, that I'd like to hear more about today. And I want to thank everybody for joining us today. But these spotlight series are designed to help highlight our membership and elevate them as they move within their careers in the field of architecture. Without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Kendall. This meeting is recorded, and we will be able to share it with folks who aren't able to attend today, but thank you all.
All right. Hello, everybody. Thanks so much for joining. It's really a pleasure. And thanks so much to VANOMA for the invitation. I'm excited to talk about, I want to talk about two things. And I get the impression that, the floor is mine and I can share share a little bit of my research, but also share a little bit of my journey. And I want to talk about one about family. So and I'll share some photos. Anybody who knows me knows that we're a family of six. It's my wife and I and four kids. And my wife and I met as educators. I was teaching K through 12, or actually 6 through 12 architecture in Franklin City, Virginia, which is down past Cortland and between Southampton County and Suffolk, Virginia, if anybody's from down that way. And I want to share, here we go. I'm gonna share a few just screen grabs of family. My mother, I think, would maybe pause at me sharing some of these photos. But I think it starts back here. And in honor of Mother's Day, I'll highlight her and the inherited knowledge and wisdom that she passed on to me, which informs the work that I do. And so here's a picture of my mom and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 of her 7 siblings. This would have been in the 1970s, even though it looks like it's dated, far, far past that. She's one of 8, and they grew up in Emporia, Virginia, which is, pretty much on the Virginia-North Carolina border. And here's I guess a 5 to 10 years past the first photo, picture of everybody. So I come from a big family, a large African-American family, and I think that's a really important note to make, because it informs not only cultural norms, but it informs the way in which I see the built environment, which is distinct and would be distinct from any other ethnic or religious group, right? And so I start here, and we can talk more about this later. But I think it's an important place for me to ground in, especially as we think about the work that I do related to architecture, race, and equity. I do it because this is my origin. And then just really quickly, I'll share, let's go here. This is my immediate family, so to speak. There's my beautiful wife and our 2 daughters, the oldest being 15, the youngest being, this is an old photo, the youngest being 7, almost 8 months old. And then our 2 boys, Thomas and Theodore, or Tom Bomb and Teddy Bear. With Thomas being the older one, who's now 7, and Theodore having just turned 3. So here's our youngest daughter, and then here's Thomas and I. Here's Theodore, and here is Destiny. And our oldest 2 we adopted through foster care, which we feel like, my wife and I personally feel like, is a ministry that requires, it takes the all of you. But anyway, so that's a little bit about me. I'm going to stop sharing here, and I'm going to transition into research. And while I do that, I want to talk about the circuitous path that I made to kind of get where I am now. I started, in high school and went to UVA undergrad and studied architecture. And I took professional practice as an undergrad in a non-professional program. So I hung out with the grad students for one semester. I took professional practice, and there is where I realized if I'm going to be super successful and be this I'm not going to say star architect, but if I'm going to be this amazing architect, then I also need to be a real estate developer. And so I went to Georgetown and studied real estate development, worked in DC and in real estate for a little bit. And I thought, you know what? I can't lose sight of this design background. So I have to go back in architecture. So I called and I think this was one of the best things I did was I contacted UVA School of Architecture and I said, can you give me the name and contact number of alums that we have living abroad? And so I cold called, which it's funny, I'm 34, but whenever I say I cold call, I feel like it in some way ages me. Like I randomly called up a bunch of alums in the UK and in France, places where I felt like I could navigate, fairly well. And I got a few responses and ended up moving to Paris and working for an architect there for about a year. And that's when I realized I did not want to be a licensed architect, but I still loved the built environment. And I thought, what else do I love? That I can bring these two things together. And for me, it was education. I loved education. And so that's how I ended up being a K-12 teacher for architecture, where I did a lot of work with the Technology Student Association, in and around Central and Southern Virginia. And again, that's where I met my wife. And so for me, that then transitioned into higher education. And my current role is that of the Director of Research and Information at the Association of Collegiate Schools of Architecture, better known as ACSA. It's one of the 6 alliance organizations, right? So there's AIA, NCARB, AIAS, ACSA, which is where I work, NOMA, and NAB, which NCARB and NAB are the regulating bodies. So yeah, that's how I ended up with a doctorate in education, and that's how I ended up at ACSA, it's my job at ACSA as the research director to, in some ways, lead the charge and understand the pulse of what's happening in architecture education. I'm going to share really briefly some of my work on the connection between my research on general demographics and architectural education and how that relates to practice. I'm sure some of this will be things that people have seen and some of it may be new. And then I'm happy to talk about the research I just kind of completed this semester at Harvard GSD, because I wear a handful of hats here. So I'm going to share. Sorry, give me just a moment. All right, so I wanted to take some time to talk about architecture and equity in the profession. And I like to start all of my lectures with a slide like this, which is an acknowledgement that the country was founded on genocide, slavery, and white-only immigration, which is why people use this term BIPOC for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. I also like to note, and I kind of say this every time, but I also like to note that this acknowledgement is important, but it doesn't actually mean that I don't have any allegiance or love of country, right? Like the things that we love, we should be critical of. And we should be able to take really honest looks at the behavior of any said group of people. And so I put this here really as an acknowledgement to say we have to reconcile the history of the United States. And that effort is to make the United States even better. So with that, I also like to ground in by creating a shared language. For me, a lot of the work that I do is about equity, not about equality, but about equity. And I define equity as the reallocation of resources in a way that recognizes history and systems. So it's about the history and it's about the systems. A lot of the research that I do currently often engages plantation landscapes because I live here in Chester, more or less on the James River. I grew up in Prince George on the James River, and many of the plantations that are or were previously lauded as parts, as essential parts of the nation's founding, are just a stone's throw in Charles City and towards Williamsburg. So I also like to make this note about multiple ways of understanding privilege. So the space that I talk about most often is that of race and sometimes sex. But there are multiple ways in which people gain and or lose privilege. And this is, I won't run through the whole list, but this list helps us understand where we can engage, where we might be marginalized, and where, as we sit in privileged spaces, where we can advocate for those who are marginalized, right? And then I like to paint the picture when I talk about race of income and wealth. This slide in particular shows Asian Americans as being the highest income, having the highest household income. And this is one that's done by Statista that talks about wealth inequality, essentially showing that the median white household holds 10 plus times the amount of economic household wealth, which many of us know a lot of that comes through the ownership of land, real estate, housing, etc. And then this is one that I keep going back to. My area of expertise is not environmental justice, but it doesn't take long exploring equity in the built environment to understand that there are many ways in which Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have been relegated to parts of cities and or towns that have harsher environmental factors. These are two images that were published in Time, I don't know, maybe 3 years ago at this point, that looked at the life expectancy gap between zip codes in same cities. So this is looking at Washington, D.C. proper, and it's showing the drastic life expectancy difference between the Southeast and the Southwest and the Northwest, where Georgetown is located. This is me making a plug for the resources that are on the ACSA website. All these things are research, either reports or exposés, if you want, that talk about, that try to not only capture a snapshot of, in this particular case, you're looking at where the women, so the experience of women, generally speaking, in architecture, but also paint the picture of the history and systems that are at play. And so I did this, I'm actually gonna skip here. I did this in a number of areas. I wanna fast forward to practice because I wanna make sure we have time to talk. And one of the questions I like to pose, or I'm either asked, is like, how does this affect what I do as an architect? How does this affect what we do as practitioners and or designers who create built, who curate built space rather? Um, and I think it's important to think about the people that do this, right? I started my talk with a explanation of my cultural upbringing, and I think it affects future practice because um, we cannot essentially we can't expect something different from doing the same thing, right? Which is something we've all heard. I think it's I think it is necessary to consider the way history and systems affect not only the built environment, but the people who inhabit the spaces that are designed, and then the people who work in and across the disciplines of architecture. And so I'm going to highlight really briefly some of the work I did with the AIA San Francisco group a few years ago that talked about where we were able to extrapolate some key points for the lived experiences of um, people based on race and or sex. And so you'll see we did this a few times. The most recent edition was 2018. So this came out in 2019. And you can see that we were able for the first time to have enough respondents in four additional, so five total racial groups to come up with some analysis of that. And so you can see that the profession as is surveyed, I mean, we're talking over 14,000 respondents that identified having an architecture degree, that the population was largely white, that it was largely heterosexual or straight, that it became increasingly more diverse the younger the population was, which you can see here, the 75 plus is largely white male. Um, and that it's largely a profession, architecture is largely a profession that people engage because, and it's tied to education and wealth, right? So we identified that, and a lot of research talks about the connection between socioeconomic status and education. And so parental education becomes the number one predictor for socioeconomic status. And so we were trying to figure out, how does architecture curate a population based on income? And so you can see that here, that the Hispanic and the Black populations were far more likely to be first generation among male and females. We also looked at student debt. And full transparency, this is now 5 years old. Like this, it's time for us to update these slides, but to survey 14,000 people among 100 different metrics is a lot of work. So we'll have to get together and figure out what the next iteration looks like. But this slide essentially, in alignment with the wealth and the income pieces I showed earlier, it shows that when we figured out the median for all of the racial groups and aggregated and distinguished by gender, we found that it was Black male and men and women with graduate degrees in architecture that held the most debt. And you can see here, it was Asian women who held the least amount of debt, whether they had a B arc or an M arc. And then just some like things that were obvious, but was good to have research to back up, is that the culture that we create in our offices has a direct correlation to ability to retain clients, retain talent. And so you see people responded that they were much more likely to stay if they felt like their work impacted the community, if they were able to build relationships at the firm, and especially if they had one-on-one coaching. It's hard to, it took me a little while to realize this, but I realized somewhere in the middle of my 20s that it's a lot less about what you're doing, and it's a lot about who you work with. To work where you feel understood, where you feel seen, where you feel like your voice matters, um, where you can be friendly, and you don't feel like there's a facade, or you have to tiptoe around, which I've worked at places like that. You're more likely to stay, you're more likely to be successful. um, this is about promotion criteria. I'm just kind of highlighting, and again, I'm running through these quickly, but I'm highlighting the fact that um, that people were most often, or people understood that they were most often promoted based on project outcome and client relationships. Many people did not know like how you got promoted, and I think that lack of transparency is a big issue. Um, I want to correspond this slide about project outcomes and client relationships as being ways to get promoted to this slide, which is average salary. We can see that for both men and women, which you can see in the dark orange and the dark blue, there's a salary increase for building client relationships, for bringing in business, which I'm sure does not come as a surprise to many people. But I want you to look at the difference that the bump makes from between men and women, right? So you can see the light orange to the dark orange. For women, the lines are actually not drastically different between men and women, when you account for not building a relationship with potential clients. That's the light blue and the light orange. But when a woman or a man, in this case, builds a relationship with clients, they receive a different salary increase. I'm flying through some of these. This one is about gender identity or sexuality, really trying to capture the experience of people who may not identify as either male or female, or may not identify as heterosexual, and who they're comfortable sharing that information with. As you can see, friends and family being the highest, clients, consultants, contractors being a lot lower. A lot of these are moments of self-reflection for us, right? Items that we kind of knew, but we didn't have research to back up. And so now that we have the research, we can stop debating whether it's true or not. We can actually start to implement policies that might shift the culture of said office. This one is the one that is like a dagger to the heart when we ask those 14,000 respondents, whom does your work positively impact? Last on the list is underserved communities. And I think I think there's a lot to be said about who commissions projects and who we work for. Like, we're supposed to work for the health, safety, and welfare of the public, but it's a slice of the public, or it's the public indirectly, because the public doesn't commission projects. And I don't have an answer for how to solve that, but I do know that more attention is needed for, at least if you ask me, more attention is needed to try to rectify the systemic and historic wrongs that have accumulated over the past, let's say, 4 centuries. Let me do a quick time check. All right, we're okay. I'm going to go through some of these quickly, but I want to call attention to what I perceived as architecture design as a design service, to architecture by design servants, and really thinking about projects that, like I've highlighted, I think there are 3 projects here, highlighted projects that look at the history and systems and try to provide an equitable remedy, right? So equity is the reallocation of resources based on history and systems. And so how does architecture respond to that? Sometimes it's the way of a memorial, right? So the memorial to enslaved laborers at UVA, um, Howler Yoon and Mabel Wilson, a beautiful project that's fairly recent. This by Lamaze is supposed to be a GIF. Let's see if it wants to. There we go. If it wants to GIF for me, but it's really kind of understanding the impact that that can be felt in a community that provides ownership and attention, right? Like the equity in this, I don't know this project like super closely, but the equity in this is in some ways cosmetic. There might be interior pieces that were also brought in, but I would argue that this is architecture. This is changing the affect of people on the street, right? So that when people walk down their street, they feel like it is cared for, and in lieu feel like, or as a result, feel like they are also cared for, right? These are Katrina cottages, which are like, they are partly problematic, but what I appreciate about this image and about this idea is that the cottages, generally speaking, speak to the history of the site. And so they're very specific in their design intention. They also, although we can have a longer conversation about it, also give a foot into ownership, housing ownership. And so I include them, not as a best practice, but as an attempt at remedying, or remediating inequitable circumstances. And then here's the AIA guide for equitable practice, which I've been a part of. There's, I think now 12. I think there was an initial set of 10, and then we just did a justice supplement, and we've also done a higher ed supplement. So if anyone is interested in those, I can direct everyone to those. And then I want to wrap up with talking about ways that we interrupt bias. I think this is really important. And I think for me and a lot of my colleagues that are interested in the research part, are interested in representation, and are interested in equity, sometimes the how-to gets left out. And I'm totally guilty of it. And so here's my cliff notes for how to interrupt bias. So we could say, let's see. Here are my 3 options. One is to stop it. So when we're in a predicament where we feel like there is a power play between privilege and marginalized people, here are 3 ways that we can help mitigate those issues. And I'll give an example. Let's say everyone on the call here, we're in a board meeting or just an office meeting, and I didn't have time for lunch, so I run to KFC and I get fried chicken, and I sit down and I eat it before this meeting starts. And one of my white colleagues, I'm not going to pick on anybody in this call, but let's say Travis. Travis is a white guy. He's actually my best friend here, but I'm going to use his name for the case of this scenario. So Travis comes in and he says, makes some joke about me being black and eating fried chicken. Maybe he says something like, Kendall, you would be eating fried chicken in here. Um, at that point, it would be, as an African American person, that is I wouldn't even call this a microaggression. That is being judged, we'll say, based on my food of choice. I should in an equitable office should be able um to not have to engage in a one-on-one with him, right? Like, me as a non-dominant person under that circumstance, I would hope that the white people in the office or in that room would say they could do any of these things. They could stop Travis. They could say, hey, no, that's not okay to say. They could say, hey, Travis, can I talk to you in the hallway? They could say, and people might have different in this scenario. I'm obviously not I haven't told you who's in the room. But the response from someone who just started working at the office might be different than the response from somebody who's been there 20 years, which might be different than the president of the company. But one way is to stop it in whatever way you feel like is appropriate. The second way, which is a little smug, is to ask questions. And so one of the dominant members of the room, a white person, could say, Travis, what's interesting about Kendall eating fried chicken, right? Could ask questions to actually either force Travis to articulate that there's a racist underpinning to his comment, or to be quiet and it can be dealt with later. The third way, which is my favorite way, is felt, found, feel. I'm going to change the scenario a little bit, just because, just for the sake of expanding the metaphor. So let's say I am in the office and a woman is coming by and I say something inappropriate about the way she's dressed. In that case, the dominant person, she should be able to rely on other men in the room who occupy the dominant identity in this case to um, to mitigate the issue here. And so one way to do that of the three is the felt, found, feel. And so somebody could pull me aside. In the race-based scenario, somebody could pull Travis aside. And essentially what you're going to do is you're going to say, let's go back to Travis. I'll say, Travis, I heard what you said. And I used to think jokes like that were funny. Or maybe you had an uncle. I had an uncle that always told jokes about fried chicken or black people. But then I found out that, this is me doing found, then I found out that they are actually extremely hurtful. Um, Black people have a long history of eating leftovers from plantations. So they eat food like pig's feet or eat food like chitlins, because they were the food that were left over and they made the best they could out of the food that they had. And so now I feel like it's inappropriate under any circumstances to be talking about food that we think belongs to Black people in a way that is inappropriate. So felt, found, feel. I think if you can remember that, that's the easiest way to issue out the rectification of, like, we don't actually tolerate that type of talk or those type of actions. I hope that makes sense to people. But I would always say at the bottom, as it says, always focus on the action instead of the person. Because people, I found over the years that people just do not respond to what you said was racist, I think you're racist. It's never produced any fruit in any circumstance that I've seen or been a part of. Um, all right. And then lastly, when we look at firms in general, I ask people usually, and so this, you can apply this to your own workspace. You can apply this to interactions and collaborations with other firms. But I usually ask people to do one of three things: is to look for the signs, look at the work, or just ask questions. So I have an example here. This is the NCAR board from a few years ago, the national board. And this is an NCARB think tank. And you can see there's a drastic difference between their board that holds power and their think tank that generates ideas. Um, and so I might go onto the NCARB website and see their board, and I might think, if I were me, I might think, I don't know that these people are going to understand my perspective on the world, my worldview. I could be right, I could be wrong, but just the sign that is being given by the people that are chosen and or elected to serve at the top level of the organization suggests that there might be some dissonance between my experience and their experience. The same could be said of a woman when you see this board that is largely men, that you might feel like that they might not understand the lived experiences. Whereas if I look at the picture of the think tank, I see a lot of diversity from age and gender and race. Not that I can tell the race of everybody in this picture, but I could feel like they might understand maybe my work better than the picture on the left. Number two is to look at the work. On the left, I have a prison that was newly designed and is located in Somers, Connecticut. On the right, I have Restore Oakland, which is Deanna Van Buren's space for restorative justice. And those spaces are obviously very different. One dealing with currently incarcerated peoples, the other dealing with formerly incarcerated people who are working to make amends in the community. And then lastly is to ask questions. And this is where I'm going to stop because I want to make sure we have time to talk. But whether you're interviewing for a new position, whether you are interacting with firms around projects, I think it's important, and I'm not going to read all of these, but the one I do want to highlight is the last one. How does the firm respond to public instances of injustice? I think it's an important one because oftentimes many of the things that happen in the world, like Ralph Yarl, like that was something which, if you're not familiar with, is the young boy, excuse me, who was going to pick up his younger siblings at the wrong address and ended up being shot. Those are instances that I can tell you from my own personal experience as a Black man, I am expected to understand that Blackness is hyper visible and is under attack. But I'm also expected to show up at work the next day and continue to do the job that I've been hired to do. And sometimes that's with an acknowledgement, sometimes that's not with an acknowledgement. But I think having a clear understanding of where people stand and having some transparency about that really aids in our ability to reconcile different perspectives and to remedy the injustices that take place. So I'm going to stop there. There's many more things I could say, but I think I'm going to stop there and open it up for questions or comments or, really anything. We can just chat. Hey,
Awesome.
Catherine.
Thank you for your presentation, Kendall.
Yeah,
Um,
thanks, Ian.
there's a few questions in the chat from Catherine. Do you want to ask them, Catherine?
Sure. So my first question was responding to your slide about parental education, because I have a young adult person, and I'm also a person who, even though I'm not technically first gen, like my parents got their college education later in life, so
Mine did too.
I still feel sort of remnants of being first gen because there was a lot of stuff that I couldn't necessarily depend on them knowing when I was going through my college experience. But so my daughter is not first gen, but I've had conversations with other folks who are sort of in my generation and sort of had my experience, and like the generation coming after us, even though they're not first gen, like there's still like this level of um, uh, uh, not uh, not being on level, right? You would think, like two generations is still not like they're still not going to be on par.
Yeah.
And so just thinking about like the affordability and like things being out of reach. And so I was wondering if that had come up in any of your research, because I still think that that's like a point of no one's really talking about it because we talk about first gen a lot, but we're not looking at the next, and that those next even second to third really being equitable still.
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I don't know that I have any specific research around if there's any difference for first generation. I do know that there used to be a study that said that the biggest indicator for how students will perform on the SAT was how their parents performed. And so what does it mean if you have a parent that didn't take the SAT? There are items like that, but I do think um, generally speaking that there is some correlation. So I have my parents didn't attend college, or my mother didn't attend college until after I graduated. She graduated with an undergraduate degree a year after I attained mine. Um, and excuse me, and um, she I was fortunate to have her have enough of a network that she understood the importance of education, even if she didn't do a traditional undergraduate degree. And she understood who to ask, and made sure that the questions were asked so that I'd have the tools that I needed. But as far as the particulars, she didn't necessarily have all of the tools that that many of my colleagues had. It'd be interesting to ask someone from Gen Z, how that plays a factor. When I think of Gen Z, I often think about um, the the scope being much larger for them, through social media, through all of the things like, yeah, I think about the scope being something that they have to contend with because they're
Yeah,
able to see what's happening in mainland China, when
yeah,
they're
they have
15 and
access to
they,
a lot more information.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but I don't have anything in particular on that topic.
And then my next question was about the survey, and you were talking about the underserved communities and
Yeah.
people that being like very low. And I was wondering if then the next iteration of the survey, you guys have talked about. Well, I assume you're doing a survey. There will be a survey.
Yeah, I
Um,
think there'll be one in the future.
um, So my question was about are more folks doing that kind of work that is more sort of like mission based or relating to those communities in their volunteer outside of their 9 to 5 versus their 9 to 5, and if there was going to be some question or about that on the survey.
I think that's a great question, and I'll actually pull it here and save it. But I do think, I mean, there's a lot of research around the idea of service being held by people of color and by women. That when there are extra things that need to be done, either at institutions, or across a discipline, that it's usually things that are picked up by the women in the office or in the space, or the people of color, right? So the idea that that if you have an initiative to help bridge the gap in education educational preparation, that it's often one of those two identities that will make sure that the students who need a little extra support get the support they need, at least in an education setting. But I think the same would be true. I'd be interested to know also if people are spending time outside of their working hours in an effort to provide a more equitable part of the profession. And I think, I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of research around
also
that.
to satisfy that desire, right? If people have the desire to do that, but they're not getting it in their 9 to 5 work, like, is that satisfying their desire by
Yeah.
volunteering for whatever afterwards?
Yeah, thank you for those questions.
Also in the chat, it looks like Kathy had uploaded the guidelines for the equitable practice. I appreciate you sharing that insight
Thank
on
you.
that.
Yeah, thank you, Kathy.
I'm actually curious, just this is maybe for anyone on that particular topic, but I feel like it's been published, but I don't really know how people are implementing what's in there. And I'm
Yeah.
just wondering if you had any thoughts or ideas on best practices and implementing it, besides it just being like a PDF that, everybody read it and everything's gonna be okay.
Yeah, so the hope with that, which was, it's part of a team that was led by U Minnesota and then UW, that Renee Chang led, but just kind of consulting and being part of the group on the side and reviewing each of them. I think the hope was that people would be able to use them either at faculty meetings or as they address issues for practice-based, as they address issues related to policy. And so the number one complaint I'll say that we hear about the guides is that they are very dense. It's a 10-part series now, I think 11 or 12-part series, that like the mentorship piece is at least 20 pages. It might be longer, I don't have it in front of me, but and so you'd have to, but it's very thorough in that it articulates the difference between mentorship and sponsorship and advocacy. And so when you go to set up a mentorship program in your practice, you should, in my opinion, refer to it to make sure that you're achieving the goals that you're set out to accomplish. But it has a long series. Each part has a series of they don't call it recommendations, but it's essentially recommendations of things to do and or consider. And so the takeaways are usually towards the end, and that's kind of how I would use them. If you don't have time to sit down and read it cover to cover, it's to look through the recommendations and see how they might apply that way.
Okay.
Let me see if I can pull up an example, actually. Yeah, I'll open up just for the sake of clarity. I have the mentorship one open. So here's the one on mentorship and sponsorship. It's 28 pages. So as I was saying, let's go to fit one full page. And so it talks about what are mentors, what are sponsors, what's the difference between a mentor, a sponsor, and a coach, how to be an ally. Let me scroll down. So there's a section here about alignment and engagement, supports that might be needed, ways to assess levels of mentorship or sponsorship across, a given culture. Here it is. Here's the ACT section. Each one has an ACT section. And so it articulates, like, if you're an individual and you're trying to find a mentor and sponsor or a sponsor, like, here are the things that you could do. If you're trying to be a good mentee or protege, here are the things you can do. And if you're trying to be a mentor, I'm sure the text on this is small, but if you're trying to be a mentor, here are the things that you can do to help bridge that gap. So something as simple as explaining firm dynamics, right? To a mentee could be really helpful because there are a number of nuances and, as it says here, unwritten rules that might affect their career. And I think, I mean, in many ways, this is what NOMA does, right? Like, the NOMA family supports, you know, people across the path of either licensure or across architecture to help everyone understand those unwritten rules or ways of working that might lead to greater success and satisfaction in their career. So I hope that makes some sense.
It does. That was well said. I appreciate that kind of also comment on how NOMA is beneficial. Do we have any other questions, comments? I saw Liz looked like she mentioned something about something could be age related. I'm assuming that was for the slide you had where you had like the side-by-side images of the folks at NCARB. I think it was the board and then their think tank. And that was a comment.
Yeah.
Liz, did you have a potential follow-up question with that, or?
I also see Laura on the call. Good to see you.
I also had one other comment, just something that came up for me over the last couple of months or a month or so, I guess. So I was at a student, I guess their pre kind of like prep session for their presentations. And so the issue of incarceration came up again, which I feel like maybe like 5 or 6 years ago, that was like very top of mind in architecture circles and is not as much now. But I guess this was related to a project specifically in Atlanta. And they were like, oh, this is, the architecture firm that's reaching out. And I was like, oh, I hadn't heard of that firm. And then I went and like looked and I was like, oh, I do know somebody at that firm. And so it came up as like a thing of, how do you, I guess, how to approach that? Like, I clearly have a student who is, like this product should not be built, and they're part of like a lot of community advocacy. And then like considering reaching out to the person who works at that firm is like, hey, are you aware of like this advocacy? Because they're like at another location, right? The project is happening in one city and the person is in another location. And sort of the conflict in that.
Yeah, I think on the topic of building prisons and other justice, I can't call it a justice facility, other buildings meant for the incarceration and detainment of human beings. I personally do not support architecture's involvement. That being said, I don't have an answer. My answers would be larger systemic things that are outside of architecture. And there was a session at NOMA last time that Jason and Kim ran. I think that was last year, about a facility that they designed. I think it's tough. I'll say I have the privilege of sitting largely in the academic sphere, and there I can pontificate about ways in which we can shift and ways we can engage the imagination of designers to do something different. But the history of harm is just far too great for, I think, for us as a discipline to continue to design prisons, particularly private prisons.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my 2 cents. And I don't think, I mean, I think a lot of the things like the 2030 challenge, a lot of the things that are related to increasing the number of Black individuals in architecture are going to be hard to do if we continue to have if people continue to incarcerate and kill really black people in the ways that we do it. I see Laura's question. I know we need to wrap up here, but she
Yeah,
says,
I think we could probably do that one more question and then wrap up.
have you done any recent research into more equitable practice in academia? For example, the conventional critique, should we challenge? Yeah, so I think that's good. We just published, AIA and ACSA just published a higher ed supplement that is all about architectural education and the conventions that we have. Let me see if I can grab it really quickly. It might be at the link that Kathy had, but and that one talks about the number of ways in which, and gives some scenarios that you could use at like a faculty meeting, right? Like something as simple as moving a deadline. What does it mean when you have a deadline set and 5 of your students come up and say they don't think they're going to be ready? Can you move it? How might that affect a student who is working? Thank you, Kathy. How might that affect a student that has to work and has rearranged their work schedule to meet the deadline that you originally set? When is it beneficial? When is it not a problem? Or thinking about ways in which students, particularly advanced level students or thesis level students, pursue projects, and how you procure reviewers that have some knowledge that could actually aid in their development. So it's one thing if I'm doing a study of Blackness, but I don't have anybody Black that can evaluate my project, like that's a problem, and so there are a lot of resources in that. But Laura, we can also just have a one-on-one and talk more as time permits, now that I'm done with school.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you everybody for having me. It's really been a pleasure. And I look forward to the next spotlight, and hope to maybe get to meet some more people in person now that I'm wearing one less hat.
Well, I did want to thank you again, Kendall, for coming out and sharing your story and your research, and also congratulate you on another degree that you'll be obtaining soon from Harvard. So thank you for coming out. And I do also look forward to our next spotlight. So if there's anybody in the audience that would like to potentially be one of our future spotlights, please let us know. We're still in the works on what that next one is going to be. But I did want to thank everybody for coming out to today's spotlight. We will post the recording online so you can share with your colleagues. So thanks again, everybody.
Thanks, Kendall.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys.